Hello, I'm Davina of sheepandstitch.com, and today I'm going to talk about what to do when your knitting is super tight. Alright, now this tends to be a problem with new knitters. When you're just starting to knit, your stitches tend to be like crazy tight on your needle. You can barely even move them around. They're just like gripping your needles so tightly. And that's normal. That's very normal for new knitters. So just give yourself a break if that's you. The reason why your knitting is so tight is because you're terrified that your stitches are going to fall off the needle. Your hands are still not used to holding needles and making knit stitches and purl stitches. It's like learning a new language for your hands. So when you're, learning French or Spanish, you're going to be awkward with verb conjugations and you don't really know your way around the language. It's the same way with knitting. Your hands are learning a new language, a new way to deal with needles and yarn and like weird motions. So it's natural that your hands, become kind of aggressive, and trying to like grip your needles and grip your yarn really tightly. So it's okay. All right, but I'm going to show you a couple tips to make your transition from beginner knitter to comfortable knitter a little bit easier. Now, the first thing that I would recommend is to get needles that are big and wooden, like these. So the needles that I'm holding right now are 7mm bamboo needles, and you can get bamboo or wood, whichever one is fine. And that's because, wooden and bamboo needles are a little bit grippier, they kind of hold on to your yarn a little bit better than, say steel needles or even plastic needles. So I'm going to show you some steel needles right now. I'm just going to try and unloosen my work first because it was so tight. All right, so these are my, wooden needles, and I'm going to show you a really bad setup, a setup that you don't want. Now these right here, these are really tiny, teeny tiny little steel needles that I've got here. I don't even know what they are. I think they're like, 2.5, no, maybe like 3mm needles, something like that. So I've got really tiny, teeny tiny steel needles here, and really teeny tiny yarn here. So this is a pretty bad setup to have as a new knitter, okay? I would totally not recommend tiny needles and tiny yarn. And I would really not recommend steel needles. So these are steel, you can hear it. Right, you can kind of hear that loud clacking noise. These are steel needles and they're very slippery. Okay, so this setup, of tiny needles, tiny yarn, steel needles is a recipe for disaster, okay? For a new knitter, this is a really difficult setup. So I would not recommend this, all right? The best setup you can have is what I've got here, which are wooden or bamboo needles and big, thick, chunky yarn. This is chunky weight yarn. This is an acrylic wool blend. I would recommend, a chunky wool if you have the option. Wool is great because it has a natural sort of oil in it. It's a natural fiber. It comes from sheep. And even though it's processed and cleaned, in production, it still retains a little bit of oil, and that makes it kind of nice and a little bit sticky. And that's great because it kind of grips your needles. Right, so wool, the grippiness of wool combined with the kind of grippiness of bamboo or wooden needles makes for a great setup, okay? So that's one way that you can make your life easier, is just by getting the right tools. All right, so another way that you can make sure, or that you can lessen, the tightness of your hands when you're knitting, is to make sure that you're actually knitting on your needle. Okay, and not on the tip of your needle. A lot of new knitters tend to knit on the tip, and what I mean, I'll just show you, and if this is you, you can kind of smile in recognition and chuckle, is a lot of new knitters just kind of knit right here and right here. They're super nervous that their needles, or that their stitches are going to fall off, so they're just knitting right at the tip. Just at the tip. Okay, and so all their stitches just kind of get bunched up right at the tip. Right, and it's a kind of really scared, I just want my needles as close together as possible so there's no chance of my stitches falling off. So what ends up happening is that, the stitches are not making use of the full width of your needle. They're only getting the width of your tip, which is far smaller than your whole needle, right? So everything gets bunched up here. So when you're, trying to move these stitches onto your needle, it's like impossible. I mean, look at this. This is crazy, right? I'm like, I have to pull it on, and I can barely even move these stitches. They're so tight. So when I'm trying to knit into them, I mean, it's going to be a really tight situation. All right, so the best way, is to make sure that when you're knitting, your stitches are getting the full width of your needle, right? So I'm just pushing my needle all the way in to my stitch, right? Going all the way around, picking that stitch out and letting it sit on my needle instead of hanging out at the tip. All right, so just try that out a little bit. Make sure that your stitch gets onto the full width of your needle, right? And let it fall off. And your stitches should be sitting pretty comfortably on your needle, okay? I mean, they shouldn't be like grabbing your work and kind of like dragging it across your needle in order to get it to move. It should be quite comfortable, right? So make sure, again, that it's on the full width of your needle. You're looping it around, again, on the full width, and drop it off, all right? So sometimes it helps to kind of, when you're pulling your stitch off, to kind of pull towards yourself a little bit, just to loosen it up. If you're a really tight knitter, that kind of helps, right? So pushing it in through the full width of your needle, around, and when you're coming out, just kind of pull, kind of pop it off once, right? And then drop it off, right? So in, around, pop it up, and then pop it off. Okay, so that can be something that you say to yourself if you are a really tight knitter, right? So like in, around, out, pop it up once, and then off. Okay, so those are some ways for you to, get from being a really tight knitter to being a really loose and relaxed knitter. All right, so the first thing is get yourself some thick wooden or bamboo needles like these ones. Get yourself some nice thick, chunky, or bulky yarn, preferably wool yarn like this. And then, make sure that you're not knitting on the tip of your needle. Make sure you're knitting on the full width of your needle. All right, so there you go. I hope you make the transition from being a tight knitter to being a really loose knitter, a really loose and relaxed knitter. Now, if you enjoyed this video, then please like it and subscribe right here for more knitting and pattern tutorials. Okay, that's it for me. I'm Davina of sheepandstitch.com, and I'll catch you next time with another knitting video.